In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across a crumbling Nazi Germany, they began uncovering horrors that would forever change how the world understood evil. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, was collapsing under the weight of its own atrocities and the relentless advance of armies from east and west. Among those liberators was General George S. Patton, a man known for his iron will, his profane eloquence, and his brutal honesty, leading the United States Third Army through the final stages of the European War. Patton was a warrior who had seen death in all its forms, from the trenches of World War I to the battlefields of North Africa and France. He was not a man easily shocked, not a man prone to sentimentality or weakness. But what Patton discovered in mid-April 1945 would trigger one of the most powerful acts of moral reckoning in modern history, a forced confrontation between comfortable ignorance and unbearable truth that would echo through generations. Buchenwald concentration camp sat on the Ettersberg Hill, just 5 kilometers from the cultured city of Weimar, a place synonymous with German intellectual heritage, home to the legacies of Goethe and Schiller, poets and philosophers who had once represented the highest achievements of human civilization. Weimar was a city of theaters and museums, of tree-lined boulevards and elegant architecture, a place where the German middle and upper classes had cultivated refinement and culture, even as the Nazi regime transformed their nation into an engine of genocide. For years, the wealthy citizens of Weimar had lived their lives in relative comfort, their well-appointed homes and refined society existing in deliberate blindness to the smoke rising from the crematorium chimneys, visible from their city on clear days. They had perfected the art of not seeing, of not asking uncomfortable questions, of accepting official explanations without probing too deeply into what those explanations actually meant. On April 11, 1945, elements of the United States Third Army, along with other American units, reached Buchenwald and liberated the camp. What they found defied comprehension and exceeded even the darkest rumors that had circulated about Nazi concentration camps. American soldiers, many of them young men barely out of their teens, walked through the gates and encountered more than 20,000 survivors in conditions that stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the regime they had been fighting. These were not prisoners of war in the conventional sense, not soldiers who had been captured in battle and held according to international conventions. These were human beings who had been systematically starved, tortured, worked to death, and murdered as part of an industrial process of extermination. The scenes that greeted the American liberators were apocalyptic. Emaciated bodies that barely resembled living people shuffled toward them, some so weak they could only crawl, their skeletal frames wrapped in striped uniforms that hung like shrouds on bodies that had been reduced to skin stretched over bone. Barracks designed to hold perhaps 50 people contained hundreds, packed so tightly that prisoners had to sleep in shifts, the air inside thick with the stench of human waste, disease, and death. Piles of corpses were stacked in open areas, bodies that had died in the final days before liberation and had not yet been burned in the crematorium. Some of these corpses were naked, stripped of their uniforms which would be reused for new prisoners. The dead lay in grotesque positions, their faces frozen in expressions of agony, their bodies showing the effects of prolonged starvation, every rib visible, limbs reduced to sticks, eyes sunken deep into skulls. In certain rooms, American soldiers discovered what could only be described as chambers of horrors, collections of macabre specimens and objects that revealed the depths of Nazi depravity. There were lampshades made from human skin, carefully tanned and preserved, some still showing tattoos that had decorated the living flesh. There were shrunken heads, prepared using techniques borrowed from indigenous cultures but applied to European victims. There were jars containing organs preserved in formaldehyde, specimens from medical experiments conducted on living prisoners without anesthesia or consent. There were detailed records of these experiments, scientific notations documenting how long human beings could survive in freezing water, how much pain they could endure before losing consciousness, what happened when various diseases were deliberately introduced into healthy bodies. This material would later be presented as evidence at war crimes tribunals, physical proof that the Holocaust was not merely a byproduct of war, but a deliberate program of extermination and experimentation. When General Patton visited Buchenwald in mid-April, shortly after its liberation, he walked through the camp with his characteristic stride, his polished boots and pressed uniform a stark contrast to the rags worn by survivors and the casual brutality of the surroundings. Patton was accompanied by his staff officers and by members of the press, because even then, military leadership understood that what they were witnessing needed to be documented thoroughly. Cameras captured Patton's face as he toured the facility, and those photographs show a man whose usual confidence had been replaced by something else, a mixture of rage, disgust, and profound moral shock. Patton saw men who weighed less than 80 pounds, their bodies so wasted that their internal organs were visible through translucent skin. He saw the crematorium ovens, massive industrial furnaces designed to burn multiple bodies simultaneously, still containing partially burned remains because the killing had continued almost until the moment of liberation. He saw the medical experimentation rooms with their tables fitted with restraints, their walls lined with instruments of torture, disguised as scientific equipment. He saw the punishment cells, tiny spaces where prisoners had been confined for days or weeks, unable to stand or lie down, left to go mad in darkness. He saw the gallows where prisoners had been hanged for infractions as minor as stealing a potato or failing to work fast enough. He saw the records, meticulous German bureaucracy documenting every prisoner, every death, every shipment of supplies. Patton, a man not easily moved to emotion, a warrior who had ordered men into battle knowing many would die, reportedly became physically ill during his tour of Buchenwald. He was seen leaning against a wall, his face pale, struggling to maintain his composure. One of his aides later recalled that Patton said he had seen death in many forms, but this was different. This was not war but murder, not combat but extermination, not the unfortunate byproduct of conflict, but the deliberate purpose of an entire system. But more than disgust, Patton felt rage, a burning fury not just at the SS guards who had run the camp, many of whom had fled before the Americans arrived, but at those who had enabled this nightmare through their willful ignorance, the comfortable citizens who had lived within sight and smell of this place and had convinced themselves that they bore no responsibility for what happened there. In Weimar, just 5 kilometers down the hill from Buchenwald, life had continued with an almost surreal normalcy throughout the war years. While prisoners died by the thousands on the Ettersberg, the citizens of Weimar had attended concerts and theater performances. While smoke from the crematorium rose into the sky, visible from the city on clear days, Weimar's residents had gone about their business, shopping in stores stocked with goods that often came from the labor of camp prisoners, eating food that was more plentiful than in many parts of Germany, because of the camp's supply lines. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this normalcy was extraordinary, but it was a skill that many Germans had cultivated throughout the Nazi years. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, a respected physician in his late 40s, had maintained his practice throughout the war, treating the ailments of Weimar's upper class with the same professional competence he had always shown. Friedrich had studied medicine in Berlin in the 1920s, had built his practice through skill and dedication, had earned the respect of his community. He was not a fervent Nazi Party member, had joined only when it became clear that professional advancement required party membership, but he had never been particularly political. He had simply wanted to practice medicine, to live a comfortable life, to provide for his family. When the racial laws had been implemented, Friedrich had complied, ceasing to treat Jewish patients not because he personally believed in racial theories, but because it was required, because resistance would have meant losing his license, his livelihood, his position in society. Friedrich's wife, Helene, had managed their comfortable household with the efficiency and grace expected of a doctor's wife in German bourgeois society. She had hosted dinner parties for Friedrich's colleagues and important local officials, had maintained social connections that had proven useful during difficult times, had ensured that their home remained a haven of culture and refinement, even as the world outside descended into madness. Helene had grown up in a wealthy family, had been educated in the arts and languages, had married Friedrich believing that their life together would be one of comfort and respectability. She had achieved that life, but it had required certain accommodations, certain compromises with the reality of Nazi Germany. Both Friedrich and Helene, like so many of their peers, had perfected the art of not seeing, not asking, not knowing. When Jewish neighbors had disappeared, they had accepted official explanations about resettlement in the East. When rumors circulated about camps and mass killings, They had dismissed them as exaggerations, wartime propaganda, the kind of atrocity stories that always emerged during conflicts. When prisoners from Buchenwald were occasionally marched through Weimar streets, moving from the train station to the camp or being transferred between facilities, Friedrich and Helene had looked away, had closed their curtains, had convinced themselves that whatever was happening was none of their business. The camp itself had been impossible to completely ignore. Buchenwald had been established in 1937, long before the war, initially to house political prisoners, communists, social democrats, clergy who opposed the regime, homosexuals, Roma, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Over the years it had expanded enormously, eventually holding over 250,000 prisoners from across occupied Europe. The logistics of such an operation were staggering. Food, however inadequate, had to be transported to feed thousands. Supplies for the SS garrison had to be delivered. Construction materials for the constant expansion of facilities had to be brought in. All of this required infrastructure that ran through or near Weimar, involved local businesses, employed local workers in various capacities. Herr Adalbert Weber, the mayor of Weimar, had walked a careful line throughout the Nazi years. A bureaucrat by nature and training, Weber had risen through local government by being competent, reliable, and politically flexible. He had served under the Weimar Republic, had smoothly transitioned to serving the Nazi regime, and would likely have served whatever government came after with equal efficiency. Weber understood that his role was to implement policy, not to question it, to facilitate the orders that came from above, not to interrogate their moral implications. He had signed permits for construction at the camp, had approved transportation routes, had coordinated with SS administrators on various logistical matters, always maintaining that he was simply doing his civic duty, fulfilling his administrative responsibilities. When the Americans arrived in Weimar in early April 1945, Weber had immediately begun crafting his defense, the narrative that would absolve him and his city of responsibility. They were victims too, he would argue, caught in circumstances beyond their control, living under a totalitarian regime that punished dissent with death. The camp had been an SS operation, state security, beyond the jurisdiction of local government. Weber had prepared documents, had organized testimonies, had built a case for his own innocence and the innocence of his city. Captain William Carter of the United States Army had been among the first American officers to enter Buchenwald on April 11th. A young man from a small town in Ohio, Carter had been drafted in 1942, had trained as an infantry officer, and had seen combat across France and into Germany. He had witnessed death and destruction, had seen cities reduced to rubble, had walked through battlefields littered with corpses. War, he had learned, was ugly and brutal, but it had a certain logic. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found inside the gates of Buchenwald. The survivors who could still walk had approached the Americans like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their bodies skeletal frames draped in striped uniforms that hung like shrouds. They had reached out with stick-thin arms, had tried to speak but often lacked the strength, had wept with relief and exhaustion. Carter had stood among them, this young American officer from Ohio, and had felt the inadequacy of any response. What could he say? What could he do? These people had endured something beyond his comprehension, had survived when tens of thousands had not. Carter had walked through the barracks, his hand covering his nose and mouth against the overwhelming stench, and had seen the conditions in which human beings had been forced to live. The wooden bunks were stacked 3 and 4 high, each level crammed with prisoners who had slept side by side with no room to move, no privacy, no dignity. The floors were covered in filth. Disease was rampant, typhus and dysentery and tuberculosis spreading unchecked through the overcrowded barracks. Many prisoners were too sick to move, lying in their own waste, waiting to die even though liberation had come. In the crematorium, Carter had stood staring at the ovens, massive industrial furnaces that could burn multiple bodies at once, and had tried to comprehend the systematic efficiency of the killing process. This was not the chaos of war, but the order of industry, carefully designed, meticulously implemented, documented with bureaucratic precision. There were records showing how many bodies had been burned each day, maintenance logs for the ovens, requisition orders for fuel. The Nazis had approached mass murder with the same organizational efficiency they brought to manufacturing. Carter had interviewed survivors, sitting with them for hours, listening to stories so horrific that he struggled to write them in his reports. He heard about medical experiments, about prisoners being deliberately infected with diseases to test treatments, about surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, about people being frozen or burned or subjected to extreme pressures to see how much the human body could endure. He heard about executions, about prisoners being hanged or shot for minor infractions, about selections where the weak were separated and sent to their deaths. He heard about starvation, about the constant gnawing hunger that dominated every thought, about watching friends and family members waste away until they died. Among those survivors was Jakob Steen, a man who had once lived in Weimar itself, who had been part of the community that now claimed ignorance of his suffering. Before the war, Jakob had been a tailor, running a small shop in Weimar that had served the same families for decades. He had made suits for doctors and lawyers and businessmen, had altered dresses for their wives, had been a familiar and trusted figure in the community. Jakob had been born in Weimar, had grown up there, had never lived anywhere else. He had considered himself German, had served in the German army during World War I, had been wounded and decorated for bravery. But the racial laws had stripped away Jakob's citizenship, his rights, his livelihood. His shop had been confiscated under Aryanization laws, sold to a non-Jewish competitor for a fraction of its value. Jakob had been forced to wear the yellow star, had been subjected to increasing restrictions, and eventually, in 1941, he had been arrested and transported to Buchenwald, a camp visible from the city where he had spent his entire life. For 4 years, Jakob had endured conditions designed to kill him. He had been assigned to a labor detail in the stone quarry, brutal work that killed most prisoners within months. He had survived through a combination of luck, cunning, and the solidarity of other prisoners who shared food and looked out for each other when possible. He had watched thousands die, had seen the crematorium smoke rise into the sky day after day, the same sky that covered Weimar. He had wondered if his former customers ever looked up at that smoke and thought about where it came from. Now, weighing barely 90 pounds, his body ravaged by starvation and disease, Jakob stood among the liberated, alive but forever marked. He had lost his wife in Auschwitz, his children in other camps, his entire extended family erased. When General Patton returned from his visit to Buchenwald, he summoned his officers to a meeting and made a decision that would become one of the defining moments of the liberation. Patton was furious, not just at the SS guards who had run the camp, but at the entire German population that had enabled it. He had driven through German towns and villages on his advance through the country, had seen civilians who claimed to be victims themselves, who insisted they had opposed the Nazis, who maintained that they had known nothing about camps or killings. Patton did not believe them. He would not allow the citizens of Weimar to maintain their comfortable fiction of ignorance. If they claimed not to know, he would make them see. If they insisted they were innocent bystanders, he would force them to walk among the evidence of their complicity. Patton understood that this would be controversial, that some would argue it was collective punishment, that it was unfair to blame ordinary citizens for the crimes of their government. But Patton believed that in a totalitarian state, there was no such thing as an innocent bystander, that the regime had required the cooperation of millions of ordinary Germans. On April 15, Patton gave the order. The mayor of Weimar would assemble approximately 1,000 residents, specifically targeting the wealthy, the educated, the respectable citizens who had benefited most from the Nazi regime and who had the greatest capacity to have known what was happening. They would be marched under armed guard to Buchenwald, and they would be made to witness everything: the barracks, the crematorium, the piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors, the evidence rooms. This would not be a brief symbolic visit but a thorough tour, conducted with the explicit purpose of destroying any possibility of future denial. Mayor Adalbert Weber received the American order with barely concealed horror. He understood immediately what this meant: the destruction of the carefully constructed narrative his community had prepared, the exposure of their complicity, the humiliation of being forced to confront what they had spent years avoiding. Weber tried to negotiate with the American officers, suggesting that perhaps a smaller delegation would be appropriate, perhaps only city officials. But the Americans were immovable. The order came from Patton himself: 1,000 citizens, drawn specifically from the upper and middle classes. the doctors and lawyers and businessmen and their wives, the people who had lived most comfortably during the Nazi years. Weber spent the evening of April 15th compiling the list, going through city records, identifying the wealthiest residents, the most prominent families, those who had been most integrated into the Nazi system, whether through party membership or economic benefit. He knew that he was selecting people who would hate him for it, but he had no choice under the watchful eyes of American military authority. The Americans had made clear that failure to comply would result in more severe measures. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann received the notice on the morning of April 16th, delivered by an American soldier who waited while Friedrich read it. The notice was printed in both German and English, brief and direct. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann and his wife Helene were required to report to the city center at 8 in the morning for a mandatory excursion under American military authority. Failure to appear would result in arrest. The notice was vague about the destination, but Friedrich knew immediately where they were being taken. Friedrich's first instinct was to find an excuse, to claim medical emergency, essential duties, anything to avoid what was coming. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were futile. American soldiers were already positioned throughout Weimar, and the notice made clear that refusal would result in arrest. Helene, reading the notice over her husband's shoulder, asked what it meant, though her trembling voice suggested she already knew. Friedrich had no answer that would comfort her. That night, neither of them slept, lying awake in their comfortable bed, knowing that their comfort was about to be shattered. On the morning of April 16, 1945, approximately 1,000 citizens of Weimar assembled in the city center as ordered. They were a cross-section of German bourgeois society, men in their remaining good suits, carefully preserved through years of rationing, women in dresses that had been maintained and mended to retain some semblance of respectability. Many wore hats and gloves, maintaining the formalities of their class even in these circumstances. They carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to respect and comfort, though that bearing was already beginning to crack under the weight of what they knew was coming. American soldiers surrounded them, armed and grim-faced, their expressions making clear that this was not a request but an order, that resistance would not be tolerated. Captain William Carter was among the officers assigned to escort the march. He had volunteered for this duty, feeling that someone who had witnessed the camp firsthand should be present to ensure the Germans truly saw what he had seen, that they could not later claim the tour had been superficial. The march began at 8:30 in the morning under a gray sky that threatened rain. It was approximately 12.5 kilometers from Weimar to Buchenwald, a distance that would normally take a few hours to walk at a comfortable pace. But this was no ordinary walk. The citizens of Weimar, many of them middle-aged or older, unused to physical exertion after years of sedentary professional and domestic life, struggled almost immediately with the pace set by the American escorts. The Americans set a steady military pace, not cruel but unyielding, the pace at which soldiers march, faster than a casual stroll but sustainable over long distances. For the Weimar citizens, unaccustomed to such exertion, it was immediately challenging. Some of the women had worn inappropriate shoes, expecting perhaps a short symbolic walk. Within the first hour, several people were limping, blisters forming on feet unaccustomed to this kind of activity. But the American soldiers offered no sympathy and permitted no rest. This march was intended to be uncomfortable, to strip away the comfort that had insulated these people from reality. Friedrich walked beside Helene, his medical bag in hand out of professional habit, though he suspected it would be useless for what they were about to witness. Around him, his neighbors and colleagues walked in near silence. A few attempted to maintain dignity through conversation, discussing the unreasonableness of the Americans, the unfairness of collective punishment, but most simply walked, their faces reflecting growing dread, their eyes fixed on the hill in the distance where they knew Buchenwald sat. As they climbed the approach to Buchenwald, the reality became unavoidable in ways that made all their years of denial seem absurd. The smell was real, not imagination or exaggeration, but a physical presence, the stench of death and human waste, of bodies and disease in the crematorium, a smell so overpowering that several of the Weimar citizens began to gag and retch. Some vomited on the side of the road, their refined sensibilities overwhelmed by this first assault on their carefully maintained ignorance. The American soldiers watched without sympathy. The camp's main gate came into view, Massive and imposing, with its infamous slogan worked into the iron, "Jedem das Sein," to each his own, words that now seemed like a cruel mockery. The Americans halted the group outside the gate, and an officer, speaking through a German translator, explained what they were about to see. His words were blunt and explicit. They would walk through the camp. They would see the barracks where prisoners had lived in conditions worse than animals. They would see the crematorium where tens of thousands had been burned. They would see the evidence rooms where proof of Nazi crimes had been collected, and they would truly look at what had been done in their name, in their country, within sight of their comfortable homes. The officer's voice was hard, without sympathy or gentleness. He told them that they would not be allowed to look away, that they would not be permitted to close their eyes or avoid what was being shown to them, that American soldiers would ensure they witnessed everything. He told them that their claims of ignorance were no longer acceptable, that the evidence they were about to see made clear that what had happened at Buchenwald could not possibly have been conducted in secret. The gates opened, and the citizens of Weimar entered Buchenwald. The first sight was the assembly ground, the Appellplatz, a large open area where prisoners had been forced to stand for hours during roll calls in all weather, rain and snow and blazing sun, standing at attention while SS guards counted and recounted, while punishments were administered, while selections were made. American soldiers had organized the tour methodically, with a specific route designed to ensure the Germans would see everything. They were led first to the barracks, long wooden buildings that from the outside looked almost ordinary. But when the doors opened, the smell that emerged made several people vomit immediately, a wave of stench so powerful it was almost physical. Inside, the reality was worse than anything they could have imagined. The wooden bunks were stacked 3 and 4 high, each level crammed with emaciated survivors who stared at the well-dressed Germans with expressions that ranged from hollow indifference to burning accusation. Helene Hoffmann gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white, her carefully manicured nails digging into his jacket. She had never seen human beings in such condition, had never imagined that people could be reduced to this state and still be alive. These were not people as she understood them, but living skeletons, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces, their bodies reduced to bone and translucent skin stretched tight, every rib visible, every joint protruding. Some of the survivors were too weak to move, lying in their bunks in their own waste, too far gone to care about the visitors, too exhausted to hope that liberation meant survival. Others sat up, staring at the Germans with expressions that held more accusation than any words could convey. An American officer explained through the translator that these were the healthier survivors, that thousands had already died in the days since liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with food and medical care. Friedrich, as a physician, found himself automatically assessing the medical conditions he was witnessing: severe malnutrition, tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, infections that had never been treated. His medical mind cataloged the symptoms even as his conscience recoiled. These conditions didn't develop overnight. This was the result of years of systematic starvation and neglect. There was no way that an operation of this scale could have been conducted in secret. The food alone, the logistics of feeding even starvation rations to thousands of prisoners, would have involved countless people, suppliers, transporters, all of whom would have known. The group was moved to the next barracks, and the next, each one revealing the same horrors. Some of the Weimar citizens began to cry. Others maintained stony faces. Whether from shock or stubborn denial, it was impossible to say. A few tried to turn away, to close their eyes, but the American soldiers were watching, and whenever someone looked away, they were firmly told to look, to see, to witness. This was not optional. This was the price of their years of willful blindness. Then they were taken to the crematorium. The building stood at one end of the camp, its chimney a dark finger pointing at the sky. Inside, the ovens were still there, their metal doors open to reveal the interiors where human beings had been reduced to ash. Piles of bones remained in corners, evidence that the killing had continued almost until the moment of liberation. An American officer explained the process, how prisoners were worked to death, then burned, their ashes disposed of without ceremony or record. He pointed to the efficiency of the design, the industrial approach to mass murder. This was not the passion of war, but the cold calculation of extermination. Several of the German visitors collapsed at this point. The combination of the long walk, the emotional shock, and the physical horror was too much. Friedrich found himself administering to a banker who had fainted, but his hands shook as he worked. Helene stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, repeating over and over, "We didn't know. We didn't know." But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. How could they not have known? The camp was 5 kilometers away. The smoke had been visible. The prisoners had been marched through Weimar itself on various occasions. The supplies had come through their city. The truth was not that they didn't know, but that they had chosen not to know. The tour continued to what the Americans called the evidence rooms. Here, the Germans were shown items that had been confiscated from the camp's SS administrators and medical staff. There were lampshades made from human skin, tattooed sections preserved as curiosities, shrunken heads, medical specimens from experiments conducted on living prisoners. There were photograph albums showing prisoners before and after starvation. There were medical records from experiments, detailed notes on how long human beings survived in freezing water, how much pain they could endure, what happened when diseases were deliberately introduced. These items were displayed clinically, with American officers explaining what each was, where it had been found, what it represented. The purpose was not gratuitous shock, though the items were undeniably shocking, but irrefutable evidence. The Americans understood that Germans would later attempt to minimize or deny what had happened. By forcing prominent citizens to witness the evidence firsthand, the Americans were creating witnesses who could not later claim ignorance. Mayor Adalbert Weber stood before a display of administrative documents, requisition orders and transportation schedules and bureaucratic forms that bore official stamps and signatures. Some of these documents had passed through his own office. He had signed some of these forms himself, always with the understanding that he was simply facilitating logistics, never asking what the ultimate purpose was. Now seeing these documents in context, displayed alongside photographs of mass graves and execution sites, the fiction of bureaucratic innocence crumbled. He had known, perhaps not every detail, but he had known enough. As the tour progressed, the citizens of Weimar were brought face to face with the survivors themselves. Jakob Stein stood among a group of former prisoners who had volunteered to meet their former neighbors. When Jakob saw the Hoffmans, there was a flicker of recognition in his hollow eyes. Friedrich saw Jakob and felt his knees weaken. He knew this man. Jakob had made suits for him, had been in his home, had been part of the fabric of Weimar life, and Friedrich had done nothing when Jakob disappeared. Jakob approached slowly, his emaciated body moving with difficulty. He stopped in front of Friedrich and Helene, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jakob said in a voice ravaged by years of screaming and silence, "You knew, Doctor. The smoke was visible from your house. You knew." Friedrich tried to speak, to offer some explanation or apology, but no words came. What could he possibly say that would matter? Jacob turned away, his point made simply by his existence, by his ruined body standing as testimony against every claim of ignorance. Captain Carter watched these encounters with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction that the comfortable Germans were finally confronting the reality of what had been done, but sorrow at the immensity of the crime and the inadequacy of any response. He had seen grown men weep, had seen women collapse, had seen the psychological defenses of an entire class of people shatter in the space of a few hours. But he had also seen some who remained defiant, who even in the face of overwhelming evidence, clung to their narratives of victimhood and ignorance. Those people troubled him most. The tour lasted over 3 hours. By the time the citizens of Weimar were assembled for the march back to their city, they were a transformed group. The confident, well-dressed bourgeoisie who had left that morning were now a bedraggled, traumatized collection of individuals, many crying openly, others staring ahead with the blank expressions of shock. Their clothes were disheveled, their carefully maintained appearances destroyed by hours of physical and emotional stress. The Americans provided no comfort, no reassurance. This discomfort was the point. For years, these people had lived comfortably, while others suffered unimaginably. The march back to Weimar was slower than the journey out. People limped, supported each other, moved like survivors themselves, though their trauma was measured in hours while the camp prisoners' trauma was measured in years. American soldiers maintained their escort, silent and watchful. As they descended the hill back toward Weimar, the city came into view, looking peaceful and beautiful in the afternoon light. The contrast was almost unbearable. How had these two realities existed simultaneously? The answer was the same answer that would haunt Germany for generations. It was possible because people chose to make it possible, because turning away was easier than confronting, because personal comfort was prioritized over moral courage. When the group finally reached Weimar's center, they were dismissed without ceremony. The Americans simply told them to go home, to remember what they had seen, and to understand that claims of ignorance would no longer be accepted. As the crowd dispersed, people walked to their homes in silence, each carrying the burden of what they had witnessed, each facing the personal reckoning of their own complicity. Friedrich and Helene Hoffmann walked home together, neither speaking. When they reached their house, their comfortable, well-appointed home that had sheltered them through the war years, it seemed different somehow, tainted by the knowledge of what that comfort had cost. Helene went to her room and wept. Friedrich sat in his study, staring at nothing, his mind replaying images of emaciated bodies, of crematorium ovens, of Jakob Stein's accusing eyes. He had been a doctor, sworn to heal, and he had allowed this to happen within walking distance of his practice. There was no absolution for that. In the days following the forced march, Weimar struggled with its new reality. Some citizens, confronted with undeniable evidence, began the painful process of acknowledging their complicity. They spoke openly about what they had seen, admitted that they should have known, that they did know at some level but chose not to confront it. Others doubled down on denial, insisting that what they had seen was somehow exceptional, that the worst atrocities had been committed by a small group of SS fanatics, that ordinary citizens bore no responsibility. They argued that they had been victims themselves, living under a totalitarian regime that punished dissent. These people would spend the rest of their lives defending their innocence. The American forces continued to document everything, taking photographs, recording testimonies, preserving evidence for the trials that would come. They understood that thorough documentation was essential, that future generations would need this evidence to understand what had happened and to counter inevitable attempts at denial and revision. General Patton, hearing reports of the march's impact, felt a grim satisfaction. He had not done this to be cruel, but to be just. The comfortable fiction of German innocence needed to be destroyed, not out of vengeance, but because truth was the only foundation on which any decent future could be built. The citizens of Weimar had been forced to see, and while seeing did not erase their complicity, it was a necessary first step toward any kind of accountability. Jakob Stein remained in Buchenwald for several more weeks, too weak to be moved immediately. American medical teams worked to save as many survivors as possible, though thousands died even after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. Jakob survived, though he would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. He would eventually testify at war crimes trials, his words and his presence serving as evidence against those who had run the camp and those who had enabled its operation. Captain William Carter continued his work documenting the liberation and its aftermath. He wrote detailed reports, took photographs, interviewed survivors and witnesses. He understood that his generation had a responsibility to record these events thoroughly, because he could already see the human tendency toward denial and revision at work. Future generations would need this evidence to understand what had happened and to guard against its repetition. Mayor Adalbert Weber was eventually arrested and charged with complicity in crimes against humanity. His defense that he was merely following orders and that he had not known the full extent of the camp's horrors was undermined by the documentary evidence and by testimony from survivors. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, though his sentence was relatively light compared to the enormity of the crimes he had facilitated. His fate reflected the complex challenge of assigning responsibility in a system where so many had contributed to atrocity through small acts of compliance. The forced march of Weimar's citizens through Buchenwald became one of the most documented and discussed events of the liberation period. Photographs of well-dressed Germans walking among corpses and emaciated survivors circulated widely, appearing in magazines and newspapers around the world. These images served multiple purposes. They provided evidence of Nazi crimes, they documented the complicity of ordinary Germans, and they challenged the emerging narrative that only a small group of Nazi leaders bore responsibility for the Holocaust. For the survivors of Buchenwald, the forced march had mixed significance. Some, like Jakob, found a measure of justice in seeing their former neighbors confronted with reality. Others felt that no amount of viewing could truly convey what they had endured, that the Germans who walked through for a few hours could never understand what it meant to live there for years. Still, others worried that this performative confrontation would become a substitute for genuine accountability. The broader impact of Patton's decision rippled through the occupation policy. Other American and Allied commanders adopted similar approaches, forcing German civilians near other liberated camps to tour the facilities, to bury bodies, to witness the consequences of the regime they had supported or tolerated. These forced confrontations became part of the denazification process, an attempt to break through collective denial and establish a shared understanding of historical truth. In Weimar, life continued, but it was forever changed. The city that had prided itself on its cultural heritage, its connection to German intellectual tradition, now had to reconcile that identity with its proximity to one of history's greatest crimes. Some citizens engaged in genuine reflection and repentance. Others retreated into resentment, feeling that they were being unfairly punished for circumstances beyond their control. This division would characterize German society for decades. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann never fully recovered from what he saw that day. He continued his medical practice, but colleagues noted a change in him, a haunted quality, a tendency to stare into space as if seeing things others could not. He became involved in efforts to document what had happened, to ensure that Weimar's role in the camp's operation was not forgotten or minimized. It was, perhaps, an inadequate penance, but it was something, an acknowledgement that silence and comfort had been complicity. Helene Hoffmann struggled with depression in the years following the march. The comfortable world she had known had been revealed as a lie, built on the suffering of others. She had difficulty reconciling the person she had been with the knowledge of what had been happening so close by. Some of her friends from before the war could not forgive her for acknowledging complicity. Others could not forgive her for not acknowledging it sooner. The liberation of Buchenwald and the forced march of Weimar's citizens occurred in a specific historical moment, the final weeks of World War II in Europe, but their significance extended far beyond that moment. They represented a confrontation between comfortable denial and unbearable truth, between the human capacity for cruelty and the moral imperative to witness and remember. The images and testimonies from that day would become part of the historical record, evidence not just of Nazi crimes but of the broader complicity that made those crimes possible. General George S. Patton, who ordered the march, would die in a car accident just months later, in December 1945, never seeing the full long-term impact of his decision. But his instinct that Germans needed to be confronted directly with the consequences of their regime proved prescient. The forced tours of concentration camps became a crucial part of establishing historical truth in the immediate post-war period, creating a documentary and testimonial record that would prove essential in countering later attempts at denial and revision. For the survivors, the liberation was only the beginning of a long journey. Many, like Jakob Stein, struggled to rebuild lives from the ruins of their trauma. They carried physical scars and psychological wounds that never fully healed. Their testimonies, given in the immediate aftermath and in the decades that followed, became the foundation of Holocaust memory, ensuring that the world would not forget what had been done. The citizens of Weimar, who were forced to march through Buchenwald on April 16, 1945, carried their own burden forward. Some spoke openly about what they had seen, contributing to the historical record and to their society's reckoning with the past. Others never spoke of it, carrying the memory as a private shame or resentment. Their children and grandchildren would grow up in a Germany that had to confront its history in ways that few nations have had to do, and the forced march through Buchenwald was part of the origin of that confrontation. The story of wealthy German citizens being shocked when Patton forced them to walk through Buchenwald is not just a story about one day in April 1945. It is a story about the cost of willful ignorance, about the responsibility that comes with proximity to evil, about the necessity of bearing witness even when witnessing is unbearable. It is a story that asks difficult questions about complicity and accountability, about what people knew and what they chose not to know, about the difference between active participation in atrocity and passive enablement of it. In the decades since, the lessons of that forced march have remained relevant. The question of how ordinary people enable extraordinary evil, how comfortable societies can exist alongside systematic cruelty, how denial functions to protect privilege. These questions did not end with World War II. The images of well-dressed Germans walking among the dead and dying at Buchenwald serve as a permanent reminder that civilization is fragile, that culture and education are no protection against moral failure, and that the price of comfort must never be the suffering of others. The march ended where it began, in Weimar, with citizens returning to their homes carrying knowledge they could never unlearn. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying to atone for their complicity. Others would spend their lives trying to justify it. But none of them could ever again claim that they did not know, because they had been forced to see, to walk among the evidence, to confront the reality that their comfortable lives had been built on the suffering of others. That confrontation, as brutal and necessary as it was, became part of the historical record, a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the imperative of moral witness. If you found this story powerful and educational, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Leave a like if this opened your eyes to an important moment in history, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History must be remembered so it is never repeated.